Let me ask you, Greg, have you, I mean, there's been so much obvious confluence between your metapsychological architecture that you've brought to all of this and the tree of knowledge and all of your painstaking work over the course of time to elaborate and articulate it out to be as expansive as possible, without perhaps superseding a reasonable boundary within which you can actually develop the typologies you've developed. And so to me, that makes you and your system very, very adaptive and very able to assimilate interdisciplinary encounters in the way that you have. And that seems to be a skill of yours, is that you're able to take encounters with different disciplines, and rather than them being apparetic to your own discipline and to your own training, you're able to somehow convert them into the chosen vocabulary with which you work and fasten them into place to complement the work you've already done, and perhaps to add to the depth and resonance of certain terms that you're already working with. So that much is very apparent to me, not least because of the series that we just finished doing. But I'm wondering, conversely, whether you've encountered anything in the course of these last months or couple of years in this vast digital forum that has threatened to challenge you perhaps a little bit more, that has perhaps threatened to challenge you with some indigestion. Sure. And that has perhaps threatened that has shaken some of the foundations of your work that you've ported to it. I assume nothing like that has happened so comprehensively as to undermine your project, of course, but I think you're someone who would have a dialectical appreciation for that. And I'm wondering if it's happened to you recently.
Yeah. Well, so here's the, absolutely. Yes, there are particular kinds of ideas that, to the extent that they would get metaphysical and ontological traction, they would then result in a appropriate threat to the onto-epistemological architecture that I've constructed, because they would then challenge foundational aspects. And it is the system. At one point I characterized it, and I think this is a bit erroneous depending on the meaning of the term foundational, but I argued it is a foundational system. It certainly has a very clear logical structure to it. It is dependent upon the Big Bang. It's dependent upon the cosmic evolutionary processes in particular ways. Okay. So, for example, I definitely got interested in parapsychology. Okay. And wanted to really be clear about because I got convinced, very much the way the world is going through aliens right now. Mm-hmm. I encountered parapsychology in a way that was, I thought it was just BS. And then I encountered it in a particular way that was like, wait, you can't just call it BS. Okay. And there is enough data in the parapsychology world to be very head scratching, in my opinion. Okay. And there certainly is an empirical lineage on Gonsfield experiments and other kinds of things that just are not amenable to simplistic hand waving from an empiricist skeptical point of view that says this is bullshit. Okay. There's something there. At an anecdotal experimental narrative that's very akin to like Tic Tac and the aliens that are, like, so the analogy is like, okay, yeah, people say, oh, there's aliens. There's nobody in the fucking aliens. And then you're like, well, what the hell is this thing that's on radar that advanced pilots are seeing that nobody can detect? And then they bring back and they study and they have to come out and say, it's not us, right? And then maybe it's the Chinese or the Russians, but how the hell do they have technology that doesn't conform to inertial laws? Nobody has any frame of reference for what that would be. Maybe it's a hologram, but that's weird. Okay. So now you have this whole narrative, this anecdotal data evidence thing that affords no readily clear explanation. And I would argue there's parapsychology lines of research that are very similar. Okay. And I would argue, people have near-death experiences. People have other kinds they speak to higher dimensions of reality, all right, that open up windows on aspects of what I'm doing that would then say, yeah, well, clearly it's incomplete and maybe fundamentally wrong, okay? So those are the kinds of things that would then sort of potentially threaten. And if there was a clear metaphysical, ontological line of cumulative explanation that I could follow and see. Now, some of them may be very consistent. Yeah, certainly the idea of aliens is not inconsistent with the tree of knowledge. The idea of a really strong cosmic consciousness that we plap into, whereby our brains are more radar than they are actually mediating consciousness. Yeah, that's different. That's a different metaphysics and a different model of psychology. And my system would be much more regulated to heuristic utility, but not really the real game, if that turns out to be the case.
Right.
Okay? So I've encountered these kinds of elements. I'm an academic trained in my own skepticism. I'm a clinician that knows I'm a bullshitter that has egoic justification to know that I'm right. I mean, that's cognitive dissonance 101. I study and teach that. So I know I'm vulnerable to it. And my commitment, very much like John, is a commitment to uncovering self-deception, being aware of my own justificatory state of being, and find stuff that threatens. That's what to me, that's what a serious academic does. And my honest conclusion in each one of those things is that they're powerful pieces of evidence, but no metaphysical, ontological clarity behind the evidence that actually affords you something that you can land on that goes beyond sort of agnostic curiosity about the incidents. And there's no causal, real explanation that can be generated that fits with anything that allows me to make sense out of it.
Right, right.
So it's just sort of like my brother, youngest brother, he went through an alien transformation, went from no way to, oh my God. And now he's very convinced that they're real, that aliens have visited us and hung out, and, he's a believer. Mm-hmm. And I respect that. But as I point out to him, every narrative that he gives, like the United States has access, we're in contact with a galactic interfederation of other aliens, that explanatory narrative that then now accounts for this is very weak and filled with all sorts of speculation. Okay. Right. So now you've filled in, you have your empirical thing, and now you've generated a backdrop story that's unbelievably rich, but has huge numbers of things that we don't know. From a scientific skepticism perspective, you're adding huge jumps in relation. So I think the same is true of the ESP and the entire psi phenomena world. I think that it's fascinating to find some of those, but they can't nail it down. You can't bring it in. It's not like there is an alien ship right in front of us that everyone agrees is an alien ship. There are things that are tantalizing, but not enough. So what have I done? Basically, my response to these kinds of things is, well, I now occasionally, I saw Sean Habermas, I'm maybe getting this wrong, but he's an integral theorist who did exonatural studies. Okay, believed in he was on integral stage, and he on talking about his own experience with aliens, his own vision about what he called exonatural studies. Okay, and basically opened up this whole layer that I would say I was agnostic about, and it was very helpful because it essentially allowed me to draw a circle, okay, on all the shit that may be real, and I'm open to. And if it was actually real, would require a fundamental upgrade in our naturalistic understanding. But I'm also of the opinion that each one of those things is anecdotally interesting, but there is no clear architecture behind it. So it's just you get the window and then you see it, but you don't know what's behind it, and you can't make strong claims. So you then stay there. So then I'm like, well, what really am I trying to do? I am working on the endo-naturalistic philosophy. I'm not. I am interested in understanding this conversation, which is replicable. It's like, well, I'm justifying my narrative to you. I'm tracking yourself. We're engaged in a dynamic verbal and nonverbal behavioral patterns. And we can take any Zoom conversation and begin to apply, and we can replicate that. We can understand that. So I'm definitely, the tree of knowledge is either onto a better ontological map, or at the very least is not a bad heuristic.
Right.
So that's, I'm like, hey, there may be all this other stuff out there. And if it requires a fundamental upgrade, if Big Bang all of a sudden ends up bad as a bad idea, the system takes a serious hit. So there certainly are these potentials. My basic experiences I'm stoned one night in 1997. I draw out this diagram. Every cell in my body is like, oh my God, this is a formula for decoding the world. in the last 20 years, I've been assimilating and integrating naturalistic facts that are in accordance with this schema. And so I'm like, well, I'm happy with it. This is the cumulative knowledge coherence system that I was seeking for me making sense out of the world. That's qualitatively better, at least than what's going on in Psych 101 classes, where people are, basically just pretending like they understand shit and then just handing them concepts that overlap and are completely chaotic. Right. So that's a long-winded answer. Basically, there are certainly some things that threaten. I tend to those. I haven't found anything that fundamentally is confirmable that undermines the system. I'm open to that. I've used that to actually be clear about what actually is the system really shining our light on. It's a natural philosophy. That's really right. That's exactly what it is.
Right, and very pragmatic by the sounds of it, in the commonplace and in the technical sense.